right, so we've learned about all the nitty-gritty to get ready to jump into starting to talk about actual assessments. So in Chapter 10, we will explore assessment of intelligence and ability. So in talking about intelligence, it's important to think about how you define the concept of intelligence, because this has been a bit of a controversial construct over time. So if we think back to some of the earlier definitions of intelligence, they refer to this sort of general intelligence factor. So it's something you have or you don't, and it sort of embodies your ability to just do everything. And so as we've gone on to study intelligence, we've learned more about it, we've looked at ways to assess it. We've started to, as a field, challenge this idea of just one singular way of viewing and measuring intelligence. And so then we get into looking at things like ability traits. So you're able to do different kinds of things at different levels, but this idea of ability traits is kind of stable over the lifetime. And then more modern ways of looking at intelligence incorporate things like multiple intelligence, like Gardner's theory, and looking at everyone has unique sets of talents and skills in different kinds of things. And so what do we really consider to be factors of intelligence and what are not? So is playing the piano a factor of intelligence? Is kinesthetic ability to play soccer a type of intelligence? So this has been the ongoing debate about what makes up intelligence. Are there multiple pieces of a person that represent different types of intelligence? Or is it really just coming down to this ability to process information, the ability to reason and use logic and problem solve and those types of things? So when you're looking at assessments of intelligence, it's important to look at who's developed them, when they were first developed, and which sort of theory of intelligence they are pulling from. So are they looking at sort of these general intelligence factors or ability traits, or are they incorporating multiple sources of intelligence in the construct that they're measuring? So as we start digging into different theories of intelligence and different assessments that relate to this idea of intelligence, it's important to consider the different factors that are at play in the way that we assess and characterize intelligence. So is it the ability to adapt to the environment through things like problem-solving skills and abstract thinking? Is it your basic ability to do mental processes like logic and reasoning, math skills, vocabulary skills? Is it kind of higher order thinking, so your ability to do puzzles or to think about more complex information? Is it your ability to process and then demonstrate memorization of information? Or are we looking at awareness and control of your own cognitive processes? So how much are you able to control and harness what your brain can do to be able to move your body or complete an assessment or do math problems or whatever it is? So thinking about which factors of intelligence you want to measure are going to help connect to which theories you should pull from and which types of assessments that you will use. So generally speaking, when we're looking at intelligence testing, there are 3 different types of tests, and some of these we'll talk about in a later chapter. The first is general intelligence testing. So this is looking at intellectual ability levels currently, not necessarily including any kind of developmental factors, but just taking a snapshot of the current state of things. Achievement testing, which is what an individual knows or can do right now in the present at this point. And usually that's pretty subject or skill specific. So we're looking at achievement tests in math and science, achievement tests in vocabulary and reading. These are what school districts use quite often to determine like grade levels or how students are performing, those kinds of things. And then we have aptitude tests. And we've talked about these a little bit in a previous chapter. These are future oriented, so they're meant to predict or project how much an individual is capable of doing something with further training and education. So SATs and ACTs are meant to predict how well an individual will be able to do in a university environment. The GRE is meant to predict how well someone's going to do in a graduate school environment. So these aptitude tests are geared towards predicting the future as opposed to achievement tests and intelligence tests, which are more focused on the state of things right now and not meant to be used in a prediction type of way. So in individual intelligence testing, there's one name that you're going to hear quite a lot, and that's Wechsler. So in the Wechsler scales, these are really widely used. They do require some specific training to be able to administer. So most of you will not be able to give a Wechsler exam upon finishing this program without going on to get some other level of certification or training to be able to do that. But you might come across the readouts of a Wechsler scale quite a lot. This one in the Stanford Binet, you'll see quite a bit. So Wechsler has 3 different scales meant for different age ranges. So the Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS, as you might hear referred to, that's meant for individuals from 16 to 90 years old, according to the publishers. There's an example of a WAIS readout on our course page. So if you want to take a look at what it looks like when you get the outcomes and the different scales of the WAIS, you can take a look at that. They're pretty user-friendly in terms of readouts. I mean, it does a nice job of breaking down what each area means and how you stack up to your norming group in comparison to others in your age range and developmental level. Then you have the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WISC, as it's often referred to. This has evolved several times since it was first developed, but it's the most widely used intelligence ability assessment for children. So you see it used quite a bit. It's for kids age 6 to 16. There's several different subtests, and then you get index scores relating to things like verbal comprehension, reasoning, working memory abilities, and then you get a full scale IQ score. And then you can, in theory, test again once someone gets to the age of 16 with the adult WAIS to see if things have changed over time. And then for the real little kids, we have the Wechsler Preschool and Primary School, WPPSI scale, again in the 4th iteration of this assessment. These are for kids 4 to 6.5. It's not really recommended to do traditional intelligence testing with kids under 4, although there are some different assessments that are available to look at different levels of functioning for kids that young. But this particular measure of intelligence isn't really designed for kids younger than 4. Again, there's subtests, and you get similar scoring on some index areas around visual spatial, working memory, reasoning ability, processing speed, these kinds of things that are more developmentally appropriate for preschool age kids going up into like kindergarten. So the Wechsler scales you'll see quite a bit used in intelligence testing. So there were a few early intelligence tests that really challenged this idea of what factors should be included in this idea of intelligence, in this construct. So one of the very first, way back in 1904, was Spearman's model. And Spearman projected that, or hypothesized, that everyone kind of had this G factor, this general intelligence factor, this sort of inherent ability to do things or not to do things. And then you have specific factors which relate to specific areas of ability that may or may not fit into this general intelligence factor. And so it's a bit controversial and remains a bit controversial because it's this whole consideration of what should be included in intelligence, what kinds of factors really should be included in the way that we are characterizing someone's ability to do something, and what makes someone smart, and what makes someone capable of living the type of life that they want to be and functioning in society. And so Spearman's idea that everyone has this kind of G factor, this sort of ambiguous general intelligence about them, in reality felt like a way to sort of divide people into classes, divide people into those who are intelligent and those who aren't, and potentially opened up a lot of opportunity to discriminate against people who didn't have this G factor in schools, in different factors of society. And so it's still, even though it's a pretty outdated model, still in a way resonates with the conversations that we have today about what should be assessed or measured to indicate someone's intelligence and what shouldn't, particularly in schools. So then we have Thurstone's model, and this was sort of the answer to Spearman's model, where there are 7 different primary mental abilities that are like numerical abilities, verbal abilities, word fluency, memory, reasoning, spatial ability, how quickly you can make sense and perceive your environment. So Thurston was like, well, this G factor is a little ambiguous, so I'm going to come up with this list of 7 mental abilities, and these things together represent what makes someone intelligent. And so at the time, there was some pushback about those theories because they were not necessarily inclusive of all kinds of different things. They were pretty specific to really more cognitive, intellectual abilities and didn't really factor in some other things. And so it was a bit limiting, despite the fact that he's like, well, I came up with this list of 7 things. This should be great. So then Vernon's model sort of is the marriage of the two. So Spearman's emphasis on this sort of G factor that everyone has or doesn't have, and then Thurston's idea that there are just multiple ways to look at intelligence. And so Vernon's model, which you can see drawn out in your textbook, he really says that there's still this G factor piece, but then goes on to define what kinds of things should go into this G factor, including things like practical, mechanical, and spatial knowledge, which was one of the first to really talk about this realm of intelligence. And then there's sort of the traditional educational, cognitive, verbal ability levels too. And so he goes on to develop this sort of hierarchical model of different kinds of things that contribute to both this verbal educational area of intelligence and this practical, mechanical, spatial part of intelligence that together perhaps make up this G factor that someone might have. So as we continue through the history of intelligence theory, we find theorists who are trying to sort of find the right number of factors that would make up this idea of intelligence, this kind of ambiguous idea of what makes someone intelligent. So we have the Cattell and Horn theories. So Cattell and Horn, 2 different theorists. Cattell is pretty well known for this idea of crystallized versus fluid intelligence. Some of you may have learned about this in your developmental psychology classes in undergrad. So crystallized intelligence being things like vocabulary, information, verbal comprehension, kind of the stuff that you learn in school. And fluid intelligence being processing speed, being able to foster relationships, more abstract thinking, sort of these inherent things that we have this innate ability to do and develop over time, not necessarily in a concrete educational setting. So then Horn decided to expand some other abilities beyond just this kind of idea of crystallized and fluid intelligence, and so they added some other factors into play. So then we have the Guilford structure of intelligence model, and Guilford's model really kind of went in totally the opposite direction of this original G factor of intelligence idea. So Guilford's like, well, there are so many different things that could make someone intelligent. And so they included like 180 different possibilities of different factors that could lead to someone being determined to be intelligent. And they boil these down to 3 different categories: products, content, and operations. So looking at these 3 categories, some examples of what these might look like is operations, which are like kind of those higher level cognitive skills, being able to evaluate, use reasoning, different types of thinking processes, memory, overall cognitive ability. Kind of like that, connecting to that crystallized intelligence idea. Then there's content, which is like understanding what things mean. And then there's products, which would include like all kinds of different things that can be in different areas of your life. So the way that you would understand the concepts of your field, the implications of your decisions in different areas of your life, different ways you're connecting and relating to others. Kind of like this idea that there maybe are certain classes that you would take in school that you did better at, and some classes that were just a little bit harder. So this products category sort of looks at things more on the micro level of like, within this particular realm, how do you perform with all of these different ideas? So when you put these three areas together, they kind of are meant to encompass every single thing that you experience in your life. And so some that look at this theory say, well, how can we possibly assess for all of these different things in a way that's accurate and not just get a snapshot of one moment of someone's life then? So it's often felt that this model is maybe just a bit too much. So getting into more recent intelligence theory, and again, some of these you might remember from your developmental psychology class, or perhaps even the human development class in our program. So we have Piaget's model of cognitive development, looking a lot at children and looking at the process of biological maturation. So how, as kids, you interact with different environments, and this helps you with your cognitive development over time. So having these 4 levels that you would progress through as you're gaining the ability to make sense of and interact with the world. So some of these might sound a bit familiar to you. He also had this idea of assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation is the way that a child relates to new objects and understands that those things are not the same as objects or people or ideas that they already know. So this idea of understanding novelty. And then accommodation. So after they've learned about this new thing, how do they then change their behavior, understanding, or decision making in order to respond to the environmental events around them or the things that are around them? So this idea of kind of learning from experience. And then we have Sternberg's theory of intelligence, which again is a more modern theory, which you might remember from those classes. And he was one of the first to really suggest that intelligence goes outside of sort of those higher level cognitive abilities. So he theorized that there were different kinds of abilities that would relate to intelligence. Analytical, which relates to those sort of cognitive higher order thinking abilities, but then also being able to be creative and able to be very practical in the way that you're navigating life processes, and all of these things together would contribute to intelligence. So then we have a more modern and very popular theory of intelligence, which is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. I have some of Gardner's books on intelligence in my office that you're always welcome to borrow if you'd like to flip through and learn a little bit more about his process. So he came up with all of these different types of intelligence processes that a person could have that would need to be assessed to really capture whether or not someone has this sense of intelligence. Because again, we're still kind of fighting with this G factor idea of like, someone has intelligence. What does that really mean to be intelligent? So Gardner has newer iterations even that expands on these ideas that are linguistic, which is like word, vocabulary, those kinds of things, logical and math processes, spatial intelligence, your ability to kind of do things with your hands and your mechanical abilities and ability to navigate space in a way, bodily or kinesthetic. So athletes, for example, would rate very high on bodily and kinesthetic intelligence because they have very good connections between their brain process and what their body does. Music and rhythm, interpersonal and intrapersonal, so how well you can connect with yourself, how well you can connect with others. And then this idea of naturalistic intelligence, which is how well you can sort of connect with the earth, connect with natural environments, and have an understanding of those systems and connection with those systems. So think about people who we say have a green thumb, for example. they would rate very high on naturalistic intelligence because they have a strong connection to the growing process of plants, for example. So then we have the Stanford Binet intelligence tests. These are still pretty widely used in school systems. The original version of this test is now about 100 years old, or a little over 100 years old. So it's been updated and changed, and there are different iterations of it now, but it still kind of relates to this original G-factor idea of understanding intelligence as the ability to sort of understand and comprehend and use logic and reasoning, and how well a person can do that. So this intelligence test uses a series of measures, so they're different scales, and they identify children who need special education programming or exceptional children programming. The way that this is scored is in percentiles based on your norming group. And if you recall back in the chapter, we talked about that kind of typical bell curve. So this sort of falls on that same idea. So the mean is 100, each standard deviation is about 15 points. And so we would look at how many children on average would fall below or above the score of this individual child to determine how they fall in terms of needs in comparison to their age group. So generally pretty good reliability with these for what they measure. And in the subtests, pretty good reliability and validity information. It's just, again, relates back to this idea of how do you categorize intelligence. So it does a good job of measuring what it measures. The real broader question is it measuring only things that relate to this original G factor of intelligence, or does it measure a broader view of what makes someone intelligent or not? Another set of assessments that you might hear quite often, particularly with children, is the Kaufman battery of assessments. Remember, a battery means they take multiple different assessments and then you put them together to give a composite score. So the Kaufman assessment batteries for children is developed a little more recently in the 70s and 80s. It pulls from that Cattell-Horn model, so pulling in those ideas of crystallized and fluid intelligence. And expanding a little bit to give hopefully a bit of a broader view of cognitive ability levels in different areas. So you see it correlated quite often with the Wechsler scales, so it's pretty comparable with the Wechsler scales in terms of its validity and reliability. So it has those 5 different cognitive abilities that it measures for children. And then you have the Kaufman adolescent and intelligence tests that are for once someone ages out of using the Kaufman children's battery, you can move into the CATE or the Kaufman adolescent and intelligence scale, which again connects to that idea still of one composite full IQ score, which combines all areas of functioning and then also gives specific scores on crystal and fluid intelligence levels. So a couple of other assessments that are out there that you might hear of, the Woodcock-Johnson. This is for individuals across the lifespan. It looks at cognitive ability level. It focuses on, for example, it's used quite often around things like oral language and achievement in schools. The differential ability scales, which are for kids to late teenagers. This was designed to sort of be a screening tool to identify children with learning disabilities so that they could be put into appropriate classroom spaces and be given different supports. So you might see this in, for example, like determining an IEP. You would look at perhaps a differential ability scale. You have the Slauson scale. This is across the lifespan, so as young as 4 and as old as 65. And it looks mostly at verbal intelligence abilities, so vocabulary and different kinds of verbal cognitive processes. And then you have the Doss-Naglieri. This is preschool age until about kindergarten until about high school. And it looks at cognitive processing skills. So they have their own sort of theory of how cognitive processing works, and so they've developed their own scale to go along with their theory of cognitive processing. So we do have this idea of group intelligence testing. You see this a lot in schools because it's kind of the equivalent of achievement testing, but in intelligence testing settings. So if you have quite a lot of people who need to be evaluated, you often see this used as like a screening tool. So seeing if people are testing on grade level at the beginning of the year, or for example, testing for gifted and talented or something like that, you might have a pool of different students that are brought together to test at the same time. So you have the cognitive abilities test used for K through 12 schools. It looks at kind of those traditional logic, reasoning, verbal, quantitative, and then there's some nonverbal, sort of more creative options on there. The Otis Lennon, again, used for children as a screener tool for gifted and talented programs. And then the Ravens matrices. These are not just for any specific age group, but it's to look at fluid intelligence and ability to adapt to the environment. So as we look at intelligence testing as a whole, we're really at this interesting place of considering if we still want to carry forward with this sort of G-factor idea of intelligence being an ambiguous kind of idea that's related to overall cognitive ability, or if we really want to expand and look at if intelligence testing is largely culturally competent, which there are many that criticize and say that the way that we assess for intelligence is very Western oriented and doesn't incorporate aspects of culture or consider aspects of culture. Is intelligence something that is developed and pretty static? Is it static over time? Is it something that's developed based on environmental factors? Is it something that needs to be assessed at different points in the developmental lifespan, or is it meant to be assessed as like a screener tool for different types of supports that someone might need? And then we've got things like the Flynn effect, where how do we account for overall IQ scores increasing over the last 100 years? Is it that people are smarter, people are better at taking tests, or that intelligence testing is either more or less accurate at capturing what really makes someone able to interact with the world in a meaningful way? So just some things to consider as we move forward into achievement testing. How is it that we're looking at these factors? Why are they important? And how do we really capture what makes someone able to interact with the world in a way that allows them to function and create a meaningful life process for themselves? So we do have this idea of group intelligence testing. You see this a lot in schools because it's kind of the equivalent of achievement testing, but in intelligence testing settings. So if you have quite a lot of people who need to be evaluated, you often see this used as like a screening tool. So seeing if people are testing on grade level at the beginning of the year, or for example, testing for gifted and talented or something like that, you might have a pool of different students that are brought together to test at the same time. So you have the cognitive abilities test used for K through 12 schools. It looks at kind of those traditional logic, reasoning, verbal, quantitative, and then there's some nonverbal, sort of more creative options on there. The Otis Lennon, again, used for children as a screener tool for gifted and talented programs. And then the Ravens matrices. These are not just for any specific age group, but it's to look at fluid intelligence and ability to adapt to the environment. So as we look at intelligence testing as a whole, we're really at this interesting place of considering if we still want to carry forward with this sort of G-factor idea of intelligence being an ambiguous kind of idea that's related to overall cognitive ability, or if we really want to expand and look at if intelligence testing is largely culturally competent, which there are many that criticize and say that the way that we assess for intelligence is very Western oriented and doesn't incorporate aspects of culture or consider aspects of culture. Is intelligence something that is developed and pretty static? Is it static over time? Is it something that's developed based on environmental factors? Is it something that needs to be assessed at different points in the developmental lifespan, or is it meant to be assessed as like a screener tool for different types of supports that someone might need? And then we've got things like the Flynn effect, where how do we account for overall IQ scores increasing over the last 100 years? Is it that people are smarter, people are better at taking tests, or that intelligence testing is either more or less accurate at capturing what really makes someone able to interact with the world in a meaningful way? So just some things to consider as we move forward into achievement testing. How is it that we're looking at these factors? Why are they important? And how do we really capture what makes someone able to interact with the world in a way that allows them to function and create a meaningful life process for themselves?